So let's take a look at the puzzle logic gate. In this puzzle, you're presented with a grid and a set of rules. And basically, your objective in this puzzle is to figure out which student is of which year and which student is seated at which terminal. And you can actually figure all this information out just from these 4 sentences here. And then there's one more step that we'll get to at the very end of the puzzle. But our goal is to figure out who is what, basically. So let's start by looking at the first clue. The student sitting at terminal number 8 has been in college longer than Charlie. What does this tell us? Well, it actually tells us a couple of things. First, we know that Charlie is not seated at terminal 8 because we're talking about 2 different people. So we can basically X that one out or color it in red or whatever we want to do on our grid. The other thing we know is that the student sitting at terminal 8 cannot be a freshman because they've been in college longer than Charlie. So we can also X that one out. And similarly, do we know that Charlie cannot be a senior because if they've been in college longer than Charlie, Charlie cannot be the oldest one of the group. So we can X all of those out. Now let's take a look at the second clue. This one's a little more straightforward. It says Diane is a freshman. Well, that actually gives us a lot of information. We can actually color in blue or green or check mark or whatever you want to do to mark this on your grid that Diane is a freshman. And it also tells us a little bit more. It also tells us that none of the other 3 remaining students can possibly be freshmen. And it also tells us that Diane can't possibly be a sophomore, junior, or senior. So we can actually X out all of those as well. The third clue is very similar. Charlie is sitting at terminal 9. So just like we did with Diane being a freshman, we can similarly fill in Charlie is at terminal 9 and cross out all of the other possibilities for terminal 9 and for Charlie. And then we have our fourth clue here. Alice is 1 year behind the student sitting at terminal number 10. So much like the first clue, we actually get 3 pieces of information out of this directly. The first is that, of course, Alice is not the student seated at terminal 10 for the same reason. We're talking about 2 different people here. The next is that it also means that the person who is seated at terminal 10 cannot be a freshman because Alice is 1 year behind them. And it also means that that Alice cannot be a senior because she is 1 year behind the student seated at terminal 10. But what does this also tell us? You'll notice that if I go back to the previous slide for a second, there's only one possibility left now for a senior if we look at that top left sort of larger square. And that must mean that Bob has to be a senior. We've excluded every other possibility for who could be a senior. And Bob cannot be any other year. So now we have a couple of conclusions that we can draw from what we have left. And let's start by looking at who could be seated at terminal number 10. Let's take a look at that fourth clue again. There are only 2 options left. If we look right here and right here, and those only 2 options left are Bob and Diane. But now we have to sort of synthesize the clues that we've already had. It can't be Diane because Diane, we know already, is a freshman. And we know that Alice is younger than the person who is seated at terminal number 10. So if Diane was seated there, Alice couldn't be younger than her. And so Bob has to be the person who is seated at terminal number 10. Now, in addition, because we know that Alice is 1 year younger than the person seated at terminal number 10, that means that Alice has to be a junior because Bob is a senior and Bob is seated at terminal number 10. And that only leaves one option left for Charlie there in that square on the top left, which is that he must be a sophomore. And then finally, we know that the student who is seated at terminal number 8 has been in college longer than Charlie, and we know now that Charlie is a sophomore. And among Diane and Alice, who are the last 2 left to figure out in that top right square, that's only true of Alice. Alice is the only one who's been there longer than Charlie of those 2. So she has to be seated at terminal number 8, and Diane must be at terminal number 11. And now we've kind of filled out everybody's information so we can also fill in everything in that bottom grid as well based on all the information that we already have. Now, for that last piece of the puzzle here. Originally, as you know, all of those squares that we just filled in had letters in them. And if we just focus on the ones now that reflect all of the true relationships in this puzzle, we see that these are the letters left. And if we read them from left to right, top to bottom, we're left with the word architecture. And that was the answer to this puzzle.